Well, one of the first signs, I think, of the failure of that project was, again, just to put it as bluntly and briefly as I can, was the willingness in the late 70s and early 80s to moralize poverty. This was ordinarily shrouded in the language of individual responsibility. Again, you can actually plot it quite specifically when language of responsibility begins emerging on the part of many political leaders, appearing in prime ministerial and presidential speeches. Individual responsibility becomes code for, if you fail, it's your own damn fault. That poverty isn't the result of luck, but rather it's the result of your unpreparedness to do what needs to be done. No sooner is poverty itself moralized than a number of crucial terms begin appearing in our political lexicon. Terms like free riders, welfare cheats, in France, the sans-papiers, the urban poor. These are all the terms that come to designate people who in fact have no share in our common life. These are people who inhabit a different order of reality. And one of the things that I've been studying quite a lot lately is the role of, I think, certain well-meaning journalists in trying to document the plight of this new class of the urban poor, this new class of people who are systemically and utterly destitute within urban centers. You see this especially in the late 80s, right up to about 1983, 1984, where journalists tried to document this new political phenomenon. And yet, even though probably their intention was to draw attention to it, the effect of it was to give footage to magazines and to news programs of people who effectively inhabit a different planet. You looked at these images, you saw the experience, and you didn't see people who are like us. You saw people who inhabit a different world, who have, by their behavior and by their dissolution, effectively exempted themselves from any claim on the social contract. That today, for instance, is the way that terms like free riders and welfare cheats are used. These are people who don't have any claim on government benefit, who don't have any claim on our mutual regard and concern. So you put these different events that all began to congeal in the late 70s and early 80s, you put them together, and I think what you get is a political system, call it political liberalism, whose fundamental effect was to cultivate an entire generation of individuals who are prepared to live in near total emotional isolation from one another, who are prepared to feel no responsibility for the immiseration of their fellow citizens, and who are increasingly incapable of exercising the kind of shared deliberation and practical solidarity that are necessary for achieving justice on a broad scale. In other words, what was affected was a generation of individuals who themselves cannot be moral agents. What they care about is the provision of social services that are performed, that certain minimal obligations are met, not who meets them. What I think is lost here is a crucial idea. And it's the idea that the task of society is a task that's given to us to accomplish. It's a vocation. Aristotle called it an ergon, but some of the later Roman jurists and later Catholic social theology would use the term a munus, a bequeath that's given to us by virtue of our belonging to the human family. A trust and a mutual entrustedness. The term munus, M-U-N-U-S, designates the principle of reciprocity and interdependence that's at the heart of our communal bond. It's at the heart of the words community, communication, communion, the commons. One of the great and terrible achievements, I think, of political liberalism was to have normalized individualism, as though individuality were a more basic expression of the human condition than interdependence, as if the ties that bind us together are only chosen by us, not given, and we can give them up at any time. The great Catholic economist Luigino Bruni calls this modernity's immunizing project. We are taught how to be immune from the concerns of one another. Incidentally, John Paul II had a beautiful phrase in his encyclical Evangelium Vitae. He described the fundamental bond between us, in describing the bond between Cain and Abel, as God entrusts us one to another. God entrusts us one to another. Just very briefly, my second two towers. The year before J.G. Ballard's fictional tower appeared in print, another tower admitted its first residents. This tower was in many respects utterly unremarkable. It was one of more than 4,500 tower blocks to be built in Britain since the end of the Second World War. You see, social housing had been the most ambitious component of the post-war welfare state. It was its crowning glory. It was partly a great Keynesian public works project aimed at civic repair and renewal after the devastation of war. But it was also, in its modesty, in the provision of, those pointy-roofed brick terraced houses that littered urban landscapes. It was the provision and the expression, in fact, of the spirit of wartime solidarity. It was the expression of the pledge of universal affordable housing, perhaps even the promise of mass home ownership. But above all, social housing was a demonstration of our abiding commitment to equality. But in the mid-1960s, as political ambition began to wane and the allure of private ownership and investment eclipsed the commitment to affordable housing, a solution to the problem of public housing was sought, and that solution presented itself, and it was irresistible. Rather than modest, low-set, interconnected terrace housing with its geographical spread and its inescapably old-fashioned feel, councils across the urban centers of the country adopted a program of industrialized, mass-produced tower blocks. These monuments to the future, with their stark concrete and glass lines, were now monuments not to solidarity but to progress. They were constructed again after Le Corbusier's modernist style. Bare, unrendered concrete walls, produced cheaply off-site as entire slabs and then assembled by unskilled laborers at a fraction of the cost. The tower blocks rose into the sky with astonishing speed. And one of the attractions of them, of course, was that they left a tiny footprint on the ground, ordinarily by about 30 meters by 20. Now, the social malaise that followed from that, what happens when you keep people away from one another? What happens when you house people in these great concrete blocks? What happens when you kill communities and you divorce them from the ground? What happens when the people you house are no longer grateful for the amenity and generosity, but become resentful by the parsimony? What happens when these places become locations where you house unwanted tenants rather than expressions of solidarity? What happens then when, after decades of dilapidation and of neglect, what happens when these tower blocks are then purposefully either torn down and used in the ends of social regeneration, making these old tower blocks now profitable? What happens when you then clad these hideously ugly tower blocks in cheap aluminium cladding? Are you getting where I'm going? Where you are no longer improving the amenity of those who live within, but the effect of the cladding is in fact to shield the eyesore for the community without. In fact, that's what happened with Grefnell Tower, which opened in 1974. The cladding, the now fatal cladding in which it was covered, the effect of it wasn't to assist the residents, but in fact to make the residents invisible to the affluent homeowners all around. It seems to me that one of the things that we have lost over this story that I've told is the capacity to encounter one another. Across our social life, we have grown increasingly invisible to one another and willfully blind towards the plight of others. What we have lost in this process is both the importance, I think, of touch and of proximity. The media doesn't quite do it. All the media can do, as John Paul II put it, is excite shallow emotions and give vague feelings of general concern. But it leaves us impotent with what to do about it. It might make us angry, but it gives nowhere for that anger to go. Instead, what we have lost is the idea of the commons, not a commons as a space where we are with others in our habitats, but rather commons as sites for location, sites for encounter, where we can come up against, in utter proximity, the lived realities of others. It's no wonder, it seems to me, that the church has always placed such a high stake on the importance of co-location, of being near one's neighbor, of eating common bread and drinking of the common cup. The church, after all, is a commons. It is a place of encounter. Let me now just very briefly do my third tower. Thank you. Where might we find a commons today? Let me conclude with a third tower. In 1985, U.S. federal judge Leonard Sand ruled that the relatively affluent New York city of Yonkers had been guilty of intentional segregation of housing and schools. Judge Sand ordered that 200 units of low-set, affordable public housing to be built in the affluent New York suburb at the city's own expense. His ruling sparked a 5-year period of political paralysis, overt racism, craven opportunism, legal defiance, and almost racist pogroms against the threat posed by the introduction of an African American and Hispanic quote-unquote underclass. Them, their drugs, their crime. There is nonetheless an extraordinary moment in a long piece of journalism in a book form written by a woman named Lisa Belkin. In her account of the ordeal, a formidable man named Bob Mayhawk had been tasked with facilitating the arrival of these new residents in this old, affluent suburb. His task, in other words, was to cultivate a kind of moral sentiment, an openness towards these new residents. He requests the assistance of some of the most intractable and bloody-minded opponents of the housing project, and he asks them to interview prospective new tenants in this public housing project. One of the people that he asks is one of the oldest and most intractable opponents of this plan. Her name is Mary Dorman. At one point, Bob Mayhawk accompanies Mary Dorman to the notorious tower block of Schlobohm, a hub of crime and drugs. It was almost a stereotypical example of what happens when you build these buildings and you simply leave them to themselves. I just want to read to you, in conclusion, Mary Dorman's experience of going onto the Schlobohm grounds. Mary expected to feel fear, but instead she just felt white. For nearly 60 years she had thought of herself simply as a person, not a white person, just a person. Even during the worst days of the housing fight, when racial slurs punctuated so many protest meetings, she didn't think of herself in terms of her race, her religion, yes, her family ancestry, yes, but not the color of her skin. Walking the hallways of Schlobohm, however, she started seeing herself as the tenants might see her. White, middle class, Irish Catholic, proper. What more did they need to know? She could already feel the blue of her eyes behind her chunky prescription lenses. Her hair practically ached with silver gray. Had all this not been so new, she might have stepped back and seen the obvious, that this is how it felt to be black in a white world. This constant awareness of living inside your own skin is what the tenants of the townhouses would feel every morning, walking out their door and into a neighborhood where their face advertised their address. Rowan Williams has a wonderful term. He says, encounter begins when we come to feel as strangers to ourselves. Encounter begins when we begin to feel as strangers to ourselves. It seems to me that one of the great things that the church needs both to rediscover in the story that it tells and in the way that it advocates for genuine change in an unjust and unequal society like ours is that these changes cannot take place at distance. They don't take place by procedure and by program. They begin above all else in proximity to others. They come in lives that are willing to expose themselves to the lived realities of others. And above all else, they come in lives that are prepared to be strangers to themselves. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer once put it, we need to learn perhaps again that we cannot love our neighbor unless we can smell our neighbor. Thank you.